You're listening to Tony Graham on Binjang 91.5, and today we're going to be talking about the Council Standing Committee outcomes, and we have on the line here Matthew Dickerson, the Mayor. How you going, Matthew?
Yeah, good, thanks, Tony. Good to be chatting to you again.
Yes, now there's quite a few things that I saw going through the papers. Now, one of the things that I was quite interested in, and I think probably the public in general would like to know about, and that is you have an investment account, and that's got about $250 million or nearly $250 million in it, and that's used, I suppose, as backup for the council in case things go wrong. But I noticed that the banks Westpac, NAB and AMP feature fairly well in those investments. Now, you might like to explain what actually these investments are used for, because I know that there's more than meets the eye with this.
Yeah, exactly right. So there are a number of assets within council, cash assets, if you like, within council, that are what's called internally restricted assets and externally restricted assets. So I'll start with the external first. When, for example, a government body gives us a grant, so we apply for a grant and they say, yes, you've got that money, and sometimes they may pay that money to council early, and part of our grant conditions are that we must use that money for a certain project. Then we'll put it into an account and we will say that this is an externally restricted asset. So it doesn't matter what we do as councillors, it doesn't matter what decisions we make internally, we can't use that money for anything else other than what that was designated for when money came across from a state or federal government, or it could be other organisations as well. So essentially that's an externally restricted asset. We also have internally restricted assets. Now, these are assets where councillors make decisions about where that money goes and how that money is utilised. The most common example of that would be asset maintenance. So when we build a new piece of infrastructure, for example, a new swimming pool, a new athletics track, any piece of infrastructure that needs some long-term replacement, then it's poor management if we build the new infrastructure and then say, well, that's it, in 15, 20, 30 years' time, someone's going to have to do some major maintenance on that. I hope they can find the money. So what you should do in good management is you should be working out how much money you might need to expend on that at a certain time frame, 10, 15, 20 years, whatever it might be, and then make a decision to put away a certain amount of money each year so that when it comes time for that piece of infrastructure to be renewed or major maintenance to be done on that, then you've got the money sitting there. And if I give you a really simple example, Barden Park Athletics Track, that's an international standard athletics track that we built in Dubbo around about 8 years ago from memory. And we know from all the work that we did in working out that track that the actual track surface, in fact, more lanes 1 and 2, will need some major maintenance on that about every 15 years and probably the rest of it every 20 years. And we know the cost of that is somewhere in the vicinity of $1 million in the terms of when you'll need to do that maintenance. So you put that money away on an ongoing basis, so you've got that money when it comes up. So you don't suddenly get there and say, oh no, what are we going to do with this track? We hope we can get some money from the state government. Oh, please, we haven't planned very well. Can you please give us some money? That's not really great management. You can look for those grants as well, but we know we'll have the money there. All of those internal and external restricted assets and money for projects that are ongoing and money for long service leave and money for various leave allocations for staff, for example, put all those together, and that $250 million thereabouts is what you end up coming up with. Now, normally we earn money on that money that's sitting aside. We earn money that's invested, obviously. With interest rates the way they are, then you don't earn a lot of money on that. And one of the important things that we say to our advisory companies that we have for that money is we want to make money on this, but we don't want high risk investments. And we did see an example many years ago of a council or a number of councils across the state investing in high risk investments, and then they lost a lot of their money out of those internally and externally restricted assets. So the company we're using at the moment is Laminar Capital. They were appointed last year, in January last year, and that's something we review on an ongoing basis as to who we use to give us advice and what investments are actually, where that money is invested. And at the moment you would have seen that they're forecasting that to be around about $2.5 million of income generated from our investments, which again doesn't sound like a lot of money from 250 million, but in the market we're in at the moment, it is obviously a very low interest rate market.
Yes, and do you use this money at all for contingencies? Like, for example, at the moment, you're running in the red because of a number of reasons. So would you ever draw down on that to solve that problem?
Well, the plan is not to do that. Unfortunately, what's happened over the last 3 years is that's exactly what has occurred. There has been money that's been taken from some of those internally restricted assets, which is not illegal. It's just not good management. So as you know, Tony, you and I have spoken about it before, that the council over the last 3 years has had an operating deficit of approximately $20.3 million. And so the way they've done that is you're not going to go broke if you're $20.3 million in the red, because you've been able to take some of that money from those internally restricted assets. But it's not good long-term planning, and you can probably do the numbers pretty quickly. After about, say, 10 or 12 years, if you kept doing that, you're probably going to be in a situation where you've bled dry all those internally restricted assets. You can't touch the externally restricted assets. You're going to be at a point where you are then in a lot of trouble. So you don't like to do that. You like to make sure those assets are kept aside there for things that they're needed for.
Mm. Now, every council has this contingency fund, if you want to call it that, don't they?
Yeah, every council has a process with internal and external restricted assets. Obviously, the amount they have in there varies depending on the size of the council and the amount flowing through in terms of the amount of cash flowing through that organisation, and also the various assets they might have where the money might be set aside for. So there's a whole range of variables there. But if you went and looked at other councils across the state, then they'd have similar sort of funds put away in some sort of asset portfolio.
So how does the money get there in the beginning? Do you put away a certain amount of rates each year, or what do you do there?
No, it's a range of things. So it might be, for example, if I go back to Barden Park again, the athletics track, when we have users pay money to utilise those facilities, then some of that money might be put into an internally restricted asset for that ongoing maintenance. So you might generate some money from those fees and charges. Sometimes it might be some rates money that's allocated to certain internal assets, and then again those external restricted assets. And a simple example of those is what's called FAGS, which is the Federal Assistant Grant Scheme, and that's money from the federal government that's paid to councils on an ongoing basis. We receive very round numbers, approximately $10 million a year from the federal government as part of those FAGs. Now, the federal government announced before the election that they were going to bring forward our payments for the 2022-23 financial year. They weren't giving us extra money, but rather than pay next financial year, they paid the money to us this financial year. So we received that money and we went, great, well, we've got that money, but we can't spend it today because we need that money to be spent next financial year, and we've got the budget that will use that money next financial year. So you make sure you've got some accounts for that to go into. So it comes in from a variety of sources to end up in those various investment accounts.
So the amount of money you have in there, is it sufficient for the size of council we currently have?
I don't see any major issues with that amount that we've got put away there. I don't see that we've got any issues with those assets. They were reduced a little bit, as I mentioned, with that $20.3 million. So they were reduced. The actual total sum of those assets was certainly reduced. But the plan from this council is to get our finances back to the stage where, first of all, we're breaking even, then we're starting to get back in the black, and we'll refill some of those internally restricted assets that had money removed from them.
Now, the Denver Airport has had a few deliberations. You've come to a certain amount of deliberations with that, and particularly about the charges and the lease, because the lease was a cantankerous issue, wasn't it?
Exactly right. And one of the things that we heard from users of the Wellington Aerodrome and Recreation Park was that people wanted to build hangars there. They wanted to utilise some of the space around the aerodrome, but there was no certainty going forward. In fact, there were no new leases being given out to anyone for any of those hangars or any infrastructure they wanted to build. And that obviously creates an uncertainty area. And one of the biggest killers I find in a business environment is that limbo status, not knowing what's happening. So even if you get an answer that's not ideally the answer you want, at least if you've got certainty, that's always better. So that was one thing that was loud and clear. And as you know, Tony, we've spoken about it before, the way going forward for this council in terms of the aerodrome, the Wellington Aerodrome, is to get to the point where it's a multi-use facility a range of different activities will occur there. The idea will be to try and get to the point where that breaks even. So it's not costing ratepayers money and it's actually breaking even. So what we went forward with, what the recommendation through to the committee meeting last week was effectively to allow people to have a lease with certainty. So a 5-year lease people can sign up for with a 5-year option that is their option. So it's not council's option. So if someone wants to go forward, they know they've got in their hands the option to have at least 10 years in a lease for a hangar or something they might build there on the site. We also wanted to come up with some sort of a better charging scheme, a fairer way to do it. In the past, it's just been a flat rate and really didn't seem to matter what size hangar you built. It was just a flat rate, and that rate was put up a little bit in the last council. But what our staff did was actually look at some comparisons between Dubbo Airport and the facilities around Dubbo Airport, and then looked at Wellington and said it's fair to charge an amount that might be somewhat similar in terms of the way we charge it, but obviously cheaper because there aren't the same number of facilities there. So it was a final decision that's been recommended to the council in 2 weeks' time has been that we charge the users there for a hangar $1.50 per square metre. That's in the next financial year, and then have CPI applied to that each year. So if you build a hangar, you can work out exactly how much you're going to be charged for a hangar. So that's the first thing. And you know you've got that certainty of the 5-year lease with a 5-year option on top. So I haven't had any feedback yet from users of the Wellington Aerodrome and Recreation Park, but I'm absolutely certain they'll be happy with the 5 plus 5-year option. The $1.50 per square metre will mean that some users will actually be paying a bit more for their hangar. Maybe they won't be over the moon about that, but it still seems a fair and reasonable price, and that's what we're trying to get to.
Yeah, that leads us to the next question, that is with the Dubbo Airport. We know that was hit pretty hard with COVID, which caused a big deficit there. Pretty much a large part of the reason why the council ran into deficit. So what's the plan there to get that back on its feet? Because it ran into millions of dollars, I think, didn't it, with losses during the COVID period.
Yeah, and I actually wonder about that as well. I think that many businesses across the nation, in fact across the world, Tony, were impacted by COVID, and what they managed to do during that time frame was modify their business model, change their business model to suit the external environment. And there are some things you can't control in business. Obviously, COVID was one of those. The Dubbo Airport didn't really change their operation. I don't think there was a lot of leadership from council during that period to change their operation, knowing full well that passengers were going to be reduced dramatically. So they did lose a bit of money during that time frame. What will be happening going forward is obviously it's all about passengers. At one stage there, we got to the point where there were over 200,000 passengers a year going through Dubbo Airport, and obviously each passenger pays money, and that means that we're generating income from that facility. It normally returns to council $1 million or more in terms of revenue to the community. So it's rather than using rates money to keep it going, it actually gives a dividend to council so that we can use that money elsewhere in the community. So obviously during COVID that didn't happen. The plan going forward now is a pretty simple one. Now COVID restrictions have been lifted and now people are getting more confidence to travel. Our numbers are starting to increase fairly rapidly. Not all the flights that were occurring before have started back up again yet. There's still a slight reduction in the number of flights from various airlines, but they're getting back up to speed pretty quickly. So the dollars will return pretty quickly to Dubbo Airport.
Yeah. Now with the nature strips, there was a discussion about that, and a draft plan was submitted, I think. So one of the questions I have is with the nature strip and the basically council saying, well, we can't mow all the nature strips, and we would prefer to have the owners around council's nature strips mow it instead. So where does that start and finish? I mean, for example, obviously you can't have farmers out there mowing the nature strips.
It really refers to what I would call the town areas of Dubbo and Wellington and the various villages there. And it refers really to the area outside of footpaths. So if you've got a footpath in front of your place, then what we're saying from a council perspective is that we don't really have enough finances to go around and mow all those nature strips. Now, we put the draft of this out on display, and keep in mind, this is a policy that's been in place in the old Dubbo City Council for as long as I can remember, and I don't know what the policy used to be in Wellington. I think some nature strips were done in Wellington, some weren't. So I'm not sure exactly the policy that used to exist in the old Wellington LGA. But again, it's all about harmonisation and making sure we have something that's basically the same across all the LGA. And so the idea here was to just put it out on public display and say, we're proposing not to mow nature strips because we don't have enough finances to do that, but we're keen to hear feedback from residents. If everyone jumped up and down and said we need those nature strips mowed, then the simple question we would have is to the community, what do we take money away from to do that, or do you want to put rates up by a certain amount to be able to do that? Now, the feedback we got from the community was largely, yeah, we'd like you to do our nature strips, but we also understand the cost of that. And really what we're asking the community to do is when you're mowing your lawn, just keep going a bit further out the front and mow that bit of lawn out the front of your place. And there have been some examples where people have told me about a neighbour that might be a bit elderly and they might not be able to get out on their footpath and mow their nature strip. And so I'm really appealing to the community, I suppose, to say, if you do know someone like that next door, then do the community a favour and do that neighbour a favour and just maybe mow their nature strip as well. So it really just comes down to cost, Tony. It just is uneconomical for council to go and mow all the nature strips across the LGA.
Yeah, that's understandable. Now, do you have anything else to add, Matthew?
Oh, look, I think one of the things that I'd be really keen to talk to your listeners about is the committee structure. As you know, we've now gone and recreated lots of committees. There were lots of committees that were disbanded in the last council. So we've put forward, and it's been accepted by the community. We put it out on public display, and the community was largely accepting of that. And there were a couple of suggestions made in relation to those committees. But essentially, we've now got 16 new committees that have been created and officially endorsed by council. The most important thing at the moment, Tony, out of all of that, is for the community to make sure they engage with council and put their hands up to be on those committees. The positions that are advertised for those committees finish this Friday, the 17th of June. And so I'm really keen to make sure that lots of people put their hands up. We have lots of those committees filled. And if people want to be able to have their say in what's happening in council, we're giving them every opportunity we possibly can. And I suppose from my perspective, I've been a big fan of these committees. From my perspective, it'll be very disappointing if we don't get community members on those committees. If some of those committees have no community members apply or only one community member applies, then from my perspective, I've been pushing this to my fellow councillors saying this is a really important thing. We really need to get the community engaged and involved in council, and committees are a great way to do it. And then if no one applies, then my fellow councillors will say, well, obviously the community doesn't want to be involved and engaged in what happens on council. So I'm really keen for the community to put their hands up for those positions.
Very good. And we've been talking to the Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council, Matthew Dickerson. Thank you very much, Matthew.
My pleasure, Tony. Always good to chat to Binjang and your listeners.
Thank you very much.